increasing taxes is not always an easy thing. It's not always a matter of "Letimalu zobona." And besides, the high-income bracket in South Africa that pays about 35% of the taxes, the top 1 to 2%, is shrinking in the country. Now, the man we seek to advise tonight, Minister Tito Mboweni, has already raised concern that South Africa's tax regime is thought to have reached the portion of the Laffer curve. This is a theoretical relationship between tax rate and the resultant government revenue, where higher tax rates are unlikely to result in more revenue.
The key thing about the Laffer curve that makes it fairly interesting for politicians is to remember it's a pedagogic device, not an explicit measure of any one country. But what it does show you is that there are two tax rates that give the same amount of revenue. There's a high tax rate and a low tax rate. No country should ever want to be in that high tax rate range. I mean, why would you ever want a tax at this point where if you lowered tax rates, you collected more money and you have more output, employment, and production? So this is the Laffer curve, which really brings together the debate about taxes.
But we need to increase what we collect as a sovereign revenue to ease our debt burden somewhat, so that we do not owe more than we make, nor consume more than we produce. So let's talk to Lynette Maart, who is part of the People's Budgeting process. Lynette, hello, good evening.
Good evening to you, Tandeka, and your viewers.
So tell me, Lynette, what is the People's Budget?
Well, it's actually called the Budget Justice Coalition. And the Budget Justice Coalition is made up of a range of civil society organizations. It includes the Equal Education and Equal Education Law Center, the Public Accountability Service Monitor, Section 27, the Institute of Economic Justice, Children's Institute, etc., and the Black SAS supports the work of this coalition. Now, the purpose of the coalition is to look very carefully at the social wage. In other words, government spending in terms of health, in terms of education, in terms of social security, in terms of transport, and in terms of certain municipal services. Because these elements affect ordinary people on the ground. And it's really from people's perspectives as it affects ordinary people. Now, the issue that we came across last year was government introduced certain austere measures, and that resulted in the increase of VAT. So for the first time in many, many years, in decades, the VAT moved from 14% to 15%. And that VAT increase has a knock-on effect on people's living expenses. There's also the impact of fuel price increases, the inflation increases, and more recently in the news we were hearing that Eskom might hike its prices. So the impact of all of that on what people actually ultimately receive. Now, there's the austerity measures and the choices in terms of policy options. For example, government said, look, we have to increase the demand in terms of poorer persons going to universities or tertiary institutions, having access to that after the fees must fall campaign. And then they said, well, we increase the VAT as a result of that. So it's looking at those measures and really studying them very carefully and making sure that the consumer, the public, does not kind of experience.
So, Lynette, can you tell me how this alternative budget is constructed? What are the mechanisms for getting all the stakeholders to participate to bring about this budget?
Well, the campaign look at the existing budget, and then it analyzes that budget, and then it makes comment on the budget, and where it finds that there are issues for advocacy, like, for example, the VAT increases last year, was to fund the deficit in the budget. We made kind of input into that expert panel, comments on that, the terms of reference, the issues around what items must be zero rated so that people can have more money in their pockets.
Thank you very much, Lynette. And Thabi, what do you think of the budgeting process that is inclusive of people and includes society as a whole? And it's almost like a multi-stakeholder approach to the budgeting process.
I think it's very important. So I was part of the VAT panel. And so I did help the minister. I was appointed by the Minister of Finance together with my fellow panelist to look at which products to zero rate. And what was fascinating is interacting with the Black Sash and NGOs that you don't ordinarily interact with as an economist. And, you know, not only did I learn a lot, but these people, these NGOs look at, you know, they're on the ground looking at nutrition in kids. So we learned about, or at least I learned about stunting, and how many South African children are stunted.
So they've got a granular view
exactly, and also on the ground
priorities of people in their lives and in the organizations, in their communities, and so on.
Absolutely,
it's a very important part of budgeting.
So they contributed to our decision-making process.
Wouldn't you say, after all, the economy is to be managed in the interests of its people rather than in the interests of vested interests and so on?
Absolutely, because, I mean, you are ultimately looking at a budget which is for the people, and you're allocating it so that it benefits especially the poor and vulnerable, so that they catch up with the rest. And we're trying to also build a big middle class. And in order to do that, you have to engage with those who are left outside.
What would you say about our budget and its process? What would you say about it as an instrument for introducing economic justice, equalizing society, righting wrongs? Is it an instrument for such at the moment?
I think it is. I mean, very much so. If you look at even the expenditure and how it's allocated, it is very, very focused on social grants, health, education. So it's, and I do criticize it as that because it's very consumption based, and I understand why it's consumption based, because it's geared towards.
But Thabi, if it is so, why have we become the most unequal society on earth after 25 years of democratic economic management and budget making?
So it obviously is historical, but I don't want to use that as an excuse, because we can't use that as an excuse forever. I think that it's poor policy adoption or lack of implementation, because I think we do have great policies. I think that we have in the past not focused on a bottom-up approach. We've hoped that there'll be a trickle-down approach, and we haven't seen that. I think we need to inject a lot of money and infrastructure development. And
wasn't trickle-down economics flawed at inception, though?
It was flawed, and I've always said, put the money at the bottom and lift those who are vulnerable. Because in South Africa, those are the majority. Stats SA released a report not too long ago that 55% of South Africans are deemed poor. And that's a big percentage. So actually our budget should be focused on that, so that we can remove them out of the state of dependence and vulnerability. But having said that, I am very against this, what I guess you call it, this, focusing on the poor, and in a way where political parties are using the fact that there's social grants and they're going to increase social grants as a way of an achievement. Actually, no, it's not. You're supposed to actually reduce.
Political parties apart, let's just look at the economic management during the democratic era. How would you score our economic management?
I would score it a 4.
A 4 is a fail?
Yeah.
Why?
Because of exactly what we're talking about. Because we've had great policies over the years, since 1994, that haven't been fully implemented. We had our last one, the NDP, which also hasn't been implemented. We're supposed to grow the economy by 5% to achieve, to halve unemployment rate by 2030. We haven't. So that's a huge failure. Actually, I think 4, I'm being too generous. The other thing is, the dependence on social grants is something that annoys me. And I think that we should work on reducing the people who are dependent on social grants rather than trying to increase the amount that we give to recipients of social grants.
Well, guests, thank you for joining us on our debut show. It is Valentine's Day, and next to you is a glass of champagne, Thabi. And I'd like to ask you finally, what about the South African economy would you raise that glass to and toast to?
Wow, that's a difficult one. To the people at National Treasury who have to decide on how to manage the budget, how to allocate, and also, especially in a time where you've got these state-owned entities that require funding, and you have a national objective of making sure that allocation is developmental in nature. So that those who can do that balance and do it every year and still remain sane,
well,
cheers to them.
I toast to renewal of economic policy making. I toast to the return of rationality to economic public debates. I toast to Economics Unbound and to my gorgeous anchor, Nana.
Cheers to Nana.
Cheers.
I toast to the resilience of South Africa's people. Good night and see you next week.